Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before we begin, I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. From hurricanes to floods and wildfires, no region of our country was immune from the impacts of last year's disasters. Last year, we saw 10 hurricanes in the Atlanta region alone, including Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, which devastated parts of Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We also had one of the worst wildfire seasons on record, with over 66,000 wildfires that burned nearly 10 million acres of land. Disasters caused an estimated $370 billion in damages in 2017. The purpose of today's hearing is to determine where we are in recovering from these devastating disasters, including challenges to recovery and suggestions on how we can overcome those challenges. We also want to understand state, local, and federal efforts to prepare for and respond to the 2018 hurricane season, which began on June 1st. Additionally, we will discuss reforms that are needed to incentivize and encourage mitigation and the reduction of disaster costs and losses across the country. The 2017 disaster season not only devastated many communities, but also highlighted challenges in how we respond to and recover from disasters. We have a ways to go in rebuilding, especially in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and it is critical we do what we can to help communities rebuild smarter and better. In November, this committee came together to craft bipartisan legislation, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which would allow communities to rebuild in a way that would minimize future disaster costs and save lives. This legislation includes reforms that will change FEMA's disaster recovery programs to make them more effective and efficient, and encourage and facilitate mitigation projects that reduce disaster risks and increase resiliency against disasters. This legislation has now overwhelmingly passed the House twice, including in H.R. 4, the FAA Reauthorization Act, which has yet to be taken up by the Senate. There are communities impacted by the 2017 disasters, and preparing for future disasters that would benefit today from the reforms in DRRA. Some reforms were signed into law as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. Those reforms allow FEMA to create incentives for state and local governments to implement mitigation. But we need the other critical reforms, including key wildfire mitigation provisions and additional resources to state and local governments for cost-effective mitigation projects. Various studies by federal agencies, academia, and the private sector have shown that for every $1 of federal investment in mitigation, there is $4 to $8 return in avoided disaster damages. Mitigation projects, particularly pre-disaster, are a wise investment in federal dollars, and the only way we as a nation will be able to change the direction of rising disaster costs and losses. It makes no sense for us to continue to rebuild the same way, disaster after disaster. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on where we are in a recovery from 2017 disaster season, where we are in preparing for the 2018 hurricane season, and the recommendations for changes that need to be made to make our communities stronger and better able to recover from disasters of any kind. Thank you all for being here. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio. Thank you for your testimony, Administrator Paulson, and I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are additional questions following the first round, we will have additional rounds of questions as needed. And first, I was glad to hear Ranking Member Titus mention the importance of the needs of pets during a disaster, a topic of great importance to me. We included a very important provision in a DRRA that authorizes FEMA to set up a veterinarian pilot program that will help communities get the help they need in setting up shelters that include facilities for pets. So thank you for bringing that up. And I will begin. Twice this Congress, the House has overwhelmingly passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which includes key provisions that will help speed disaster recovery and mitigate disaster risks. The legislation changes in authorities in DRRA will save lives. Property and taxpayer dollars, and the Senate has yet to act on this important legislation. To all witnesses here, how important do you think it is that Congress enact the provisions contained in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act? Mr. Byard, you may start.
Yes, sir. We appreciate the committee's commitment to improving our nation's resilience and response to disasters. You know, the DRRA would incentivize that investment in pre-disaster mitigation, very, similar to what Administrator Paulson just laid out. Building a nation of resilience, building a culture of resilience is one of the administrator's top strategic goals. Thank you.
The Corps of Engineers certainly supports any effort to increase the resilience of the nation's infrastructure and to promote life, health, safety measures. We also support, investments in mitigation up front. We're working on the Mitigation Function Leadership Group with our federal agency partners on the development of a national mitigation investment strategy. If you take a look at the dollar amounts associated with the supplementals of storms since Hurricane Katrina, if you took a fraction of that amount and investigated in mitigation, perhaps we would be able to mitigate the damages that we see today in our response and recovery operations. Thank you.
The National Emergency Management Agency or Association supports this legislation and remains active in helping work towards its passage. The key provisions that are most important for us are the National Public Infrastructure Pre-Disaster Hazard Mitigation, that provision to take 6% of disaster funding and make it available for pre-disaster mitigation is, I think, a game changer in terms of our nation's resilience. Support also for the management costs, the ability to change that current level of funding from 3.34% to 12%, split 7% to the state, 5% to local governments. If that happens, if we're ever able to implement that Administrator Long's vision of FEMA for the emergency management enterprise in the nation, creating a more collaborative disaster management process, that allows us to fund that capability and build a more collaborative emergency management system. The National Emergency Management Association opposes the duplication of benefits provision there. We think that the ability to waive some of these things could lead to other agencies trying to reach into the disaster relief fund, and that could create potential problems in funding streams for funding the nation's disaster readiness.
Building on Mr. Sheehan's discussion there, the International Association of Emergency Managers also supports, and we urge everyone to remember that this policy, it is policy and it's written, but it saves lives. And if it's not saving a life, it's impacting quality of life. And for those that are less willing to look at passing such legislation, remember it may be your family that's dealing with this legislation and policy in the future, and make sure that you can live with whatever that comes up to be. Incentives for states and locals are imperative. It helps us to continue to drive mitigation as a culture in our own communities so that we can teach that culture to the citizens that live in our communities. But consider the possibilities of additionally adding the benefit and incentives to the local citizen, the private sector partners we have, the nonprofits, and the other non-governmental agencies within those jurisdictions. How can those incentives also be directly applied so that the culture can be continued to be built?
As you're sitting here listening, and you see that almost every agency that responds to disasters recognizes very clearly that pre-disaster mitigation works. It does save lives, it saves property, We saw after Hurricane Andrew, we made significant changes in our building code. You saw Hurricane Irma go through the Keys. The houses that were built to the new code are still there. They're doing fine. Some of them didn't even lose their roof tiles. They went across the top of my house in South Florida and no damage at all. If you look at last year's disaster spending, over $200 billion spent on disasters. Just taking 6% of that and applying to pre-disaster mitigation, can you imagine the impact this will have across this entire country as far as building resiliency in our system? I think, so back to you, I know you're over your 5 minutes, but Mr. Barletta, the question that you asked, will it have an impact? Of course it would, and a very, very positive impact. And I think it's extremely important that we push this very hard to get it not only through here, but also through the Senate. Thank you for the question.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.